Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm looking at the second and third chapters of A Conscious Universe, a Christian apologetic book by Almando Calvo. If you want to hear my review of the first chapter, you'll find a link in the description. Chapter 2 opens with a little monologue about trees.
Have you ever looked at a tree and noticed how every branch of that tree sprouts outwards and up toward the sun, toward the heavens? Notice how each branch grows its own two sets of branches, like a pair of arms, as if the trees are giving praise to a higher being.
Now, I don't think Mr. Calvo is saying the trees are actually sentient, and they're reaching up to the sky on purpose to praise God. He says it's as if they're giving praise. But he keeps riffing on this theme, saying,
Plants faithfully grow and sprout up and out toward the sun. The simplicity of how nature responds to the light, heat, and energy of the sun demonstrates the praise and worship we humans display towards the ultimate energy and life source. What is it about all of creation giving praise to an ultimate source?
Even if the trees and flowers aren't doing it on purpose, Calvo really seemed to think there's some significance to the way they reach up to their life source. Like maybe he thinks they were designed to look like they're praising God, as a symbol to help us understand that all of creation owes praise to a creator. Notice that he doesn't reference any naturalistic explanation for the way trees grow. Now, I'm not trained in this area, but to me it seems clear that the branches need to spread out to make room for every leaf to be exposed to the sun. If they grew closer together, there would be more chance of them getting all twisted up, and there would be less surface area available to receive sunlight. Now, plants pass on their traits through DNA, just like all living creatures. So, the branch formations that are good for getting sunlight are more likely to survive. That's why we're most likely to see those formations today. Again, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not sure that my explanation is perfect, but the point is, anyone with common sense can think of some possible reasons why trees look the way they do. There's no need to bring in a hypothesis about an invisible spirit designing the trees to praise him or to look like they're praising him as a sign unto the world. The fact that it looks to us like praise says more about us than it says about the trees. Human beings are naturally poets. We use our imagination to come up with meanings for everything we see in nature. We see faces in the clouds and in the stars. We imagine spirits in the water, spirits in the trees, and a great spirit in the sky. This is like what we do. There are evolutionary reasons for this. As Richard Dawkins has pointed out, there's a survival advantage in being paranoid. If you hear something moving in the bushes and you don't know if it's the wind or if there's somebody in there, like a tiger, it's better to assume there might be a tiger because then you run away. So we're built to assume that there's somebody hiding behind every sound we hear, everything we see. Thus, we imagine personality in everything, even the clouds, even the sky. This is one of the interesting things about people. It's the source of all our poetry and myth-making, but that doesn't mean that what we imagine is real. After his tree monologue, Mr. Calvo devotes the next big section to some broad observations about the way living creatures are designed. He identifies 4 elements that he says are essential to all forms of life: light, water, air, and food.
The vital needs of a plant are very much like our own. They need light, water, air, and food. The relative importance of each of these elements differ widely among plants, but the 4 basic elements are a necessity to every living plant.
He spends several pages discussing how these 4 elements are used by plants, animals, and humans. Human beings have their own subsection apart from animals, even though, of course, humans are a species of animal. It looks like the information here was lifted directly from a textbook. About 6 consecutive pages of the book appear to be copy-pasted from some other source. The author does cite a lesson on plants from the University of Florida, but is that also the source for the other 2 subsections? I couldn't tell. In any case, I'm just here to address the arguments. As far as I can tell, Mr. Calvo is arguing that plants and animals sharing these characteristics indicates a design that is both intelligent and purposeful.
The cyclical patterns of these 4 elements seem to be consistent. These 4 basic principles seem to exist for an important reason: life. With the goals set in place, we seem to have an ordered, unchanging progression. Without a purpose, we would only see random results, not consistent ones.
But Calvo's use of the word random shows a basic misunderstanding of the way evolution works. Genetic variation may be more or less random, but the process of natural selection is anything but random. Only the plants that could absorb water and nutrients from the soil were able to endure. Only the animals that could eat and digest food lived long enough to produce offspring. Only the species that were adapted to their environment survived. What we see today are the results of a billion-year process that preserved only the creatures that were able to do these things. If Mr. Calvo looks at the biological characteristics of plants and animals and sees evidence of a grand design, I see evidence of common ancestry. There are certain survival strategies that are common to all living creatures. Of course, why wouldn't there be? We're all biological creatures living on the same planet, trying to survive in similar conditions. And all life on Earth is related. So if you're finding patterns, what you're seeing is family resemblance. Calvo also argues that the Creator's purpose is revealed in the way our environment is perfectly designed to support life. Of course, it's exactly the other way around. The environment was not designed to support us. Rather, life adapted to survive in this environment. The kinds of life that can't survive on Earth don't exist here, because they can't. When you look around, what you're seeing are the life forms that can breathe this kind of air, live on these nutrients, survive in these temperatures. This is what life on Earth looks like. I mean, what else would you expect? Are you looking for creatures that breathe helium and eat plutonium? They didn't develop because they wouldn't survive. If we did see them, that would give us cause to wonder if some supernatural force is sustaining them. But no. The life forms we see on Earth are exactly the kinds we would expect to develop through natural processes. I just want to add that the amount of material Mr. Calvo devotes to this section, several entire pages apparently cribbed from a science textbook, seems to me wholly unnecessary. If he wanted to say there are recurrent themes throughout creation, with plants and animals having certain needs in common, he could have said so in one page, or in one paragraph. Adding pages and pages of gratuitous details didn't make the argument any stronger. I'm pointing this out because it's not only an issue in this chapter. There are several sections of the book that are unnecessarily padded so that it seems as if the author has lots to say, when he's actually just filibustering with a bunch of needless elaboration. Calvo follows this section with a series of quotes where Jesus talks about light, water, air, and food. I am the light of the world. Whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never be thirsty again. He breathed on them and said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. These are really cool quotes. I would totally hang out with a dude who talks like that. But the conclusion that Mr. Calvo draws is just bizarre.
Either Jesus was a scientific genius who knew about these four principles thousands of years before scientific observation and tests, or Jesus is the source by which we receive these things. The question is now, if Jesus is not the source of life, then how did he know of the four basic elements, and why would he use them to apply them to himself?
You don't have to be a scientific genius to recognize that people and animals need to breathe, or that we all need to eat. These are basic, inescapable facts about life. You can't not know these things. Do you think ancient people liked stumbling around in the dark and dying of thirst until the Bible told them light and water are good? There's nothing here that requires scientific knowledge. Rather, this is a perfect example of the pre-scientific worldview. Why do we need water? Why do we need to breathe? Because God. As human beings, we recognize the universal reality that we depend on light to see. We need food to live, so it makes perfect sense that these realities would turn up in our myths. We imagine a God saying, here's bread for you to eat. Here's light for you to see. Why wouldn't we imagine God that way? These biblical writings are works of literature by humans, reflecting on what we need and what we value. Whoever came up with these sayings, whether it was the gospel writers, their sources, or Jesus himself, was talking in a mythological way about the human experience. Again, what else would you expect to see? Of course we imagine a God who says, I am the bread, I am the light. If someone wrote a myth that portrayed God as saying, I am poison, I am darkness, or I am the Eggman, I am the walrus, who would worship that God? Maybe someone would, but it's not as universally relatable, so it's less likely to become a major religion. As a side note, these are not all the Bible quotes Mr. Calvo cited. There were a few pages of them, and I just grabbed the ones I liked best. But it was notable that many of them came from the Gospel according to John. This is significant because the other Gospel writers don't really portray Jesus as talking this way. For instance, while John quotes Jesus as saying, I am the light of the world, Matthew records him saying the opposite. You are the light of the world. This is not necessarily a contradiction. Jesus obviously could have said both of these things, but it shows that the Gospel writers had their own perspectives on who Jesus was. This will come up again when we review a chapter that's all about Jesus. Chapter 2 could have ended there, but Mr. Calvo sneaks in one more argument about the harmony of the spheres. He explains that
Kepler, a young 27 years old astronomer at his time, discovered the orbital patterns of the planets. His observations seemed to have led him to the conclusion that there had to be some type of manifestation of divine order.
He gives a summary of Kepler's laws of planetary motion, going on to say that
many theories have risen about this discovery, but they all assume that the cause was nothing more than the process of unintelligence and gravitational intervention with no purposeful direction, just a random cause. But this doesn't seem to line up with our logical understanding of design, purpose, and order.
What is our logical understanding of design, purpose, and order? Seriously, you're speaking as if we know what a designed universe would look like, and we know what an undesigned universe would look like, and we have criteria to determine which kind of universe we're in? But what are the criteria? This is the only universe we've ever seen. As far as we can tell, it seems to follow consistent principles we call laws of physics, but that doesn't tell us anything about how it came about. The laws of physics might be a setting that applies only to our universe, or they might be necessary, eternal, and changeless, like God is in your story. If someone asked you why there's a God, not how do we know he exists, but why does he exist? Where did he come from? You'd say that he just is. He's eternal, causeless, self-existent. Well, the laws of physics might be like that. I don't know that that's the case. How could I possibly know? But it's at least as good a hypothesis as yours. And in fact, it's a little bit better because it's postulating the self-existence of something we actually observe to exist, the universe, instead of something we can't observe at all, an invisible, omnipresent spirit. But I'm still curious about what you think an undesigned universe would look like. You seem to think it would be random, chaotic, lawless, with gravity switching on and off at random times. The planets knocking around like billiard balls? Why? With no gods to interfere, what would cause gravity to change? Why couldn't the physical universe just do what it does because that's what physical things do? If there were some random, unexplained thing, if a planet suddenly broke free from its orbit, seemingly violating the laws of physics, Mr. Calvo wouldn't therefore conclude that we live in a lawless universe. Rather, he would claim it as proof of supernatural interference. A miracle! Ultimately, both order and disorder are claimed as proofs of God. This is not evidence. This is a determination to insert God into whatever you observe. That concludes Chapter 2. I think we can deal with Chapter 3 rather more quickly. This chapter is a discussion of the human brain, and it argues, basically, that the brain is so sophisticated and complex that it must have been designed by an intelligent creator. In other words, there's nothing new here. While the last chapter focused on plants and animals and planetary motion, and this one focuses on brains, it's essentially the same intelligent design argument all over again. As before, Mr. Calvo copy-pastes pages and pages of gratuitous details. He doesn't credit a source this time, but the material appears to be copied from a textbook about the brain. It lists the various parts of the brain and their individual functions, hoping, I guess, to impress us with its complexity.
Frontal lobe functions: attention and concentration, a focused mind willing to learn, grow, and explore, taking in information and storing it away, a mental effort of direction.
Self-monitoring: the ability to monitor and regulate self-presentations, emotions, and behaviors in response to social environments and situations. A literal awareness of your actions and impact you make in your environment.
And so on for the next several pages. And it's very impressive. The human brain is amazing. But I'm still missing the part where you tell me why we need a god to do this. All the characteristics of the brain that you mentioned give us a distinct survival advantage over primates that do not have them. It's clear that natural selection would favor these characteristics. That's why they developed. What exactly is the problem? Also, I'm not sure if I should bring this up, but if thinking and reason and logic were all actually occurring in some immaterial spirit realm, why would God bother to give us all this hardware? I mean, God and the angels allegedly don't need physical brains to think, and we presumably won't need them in the afterlife, so why do we need them now? What's the purpose in our having these incredibly sophisticated brains if we can think with or without them by the power of God? I understand that we're supposed to be physical creatures who can think. That's like the theme of the whole project. But God presumably could put thoughts into anything. We could walk around with empty skulls, and God could just magically imbue us with the power to reason. Why would he bother giving us frontal lobes and cerebrum and cerebellum and all the rest? I hesitate to ask this question because I know the theologians and apologists will have no trouble coming up with an answer. They can claim anything they want about God's motivations here, and there's no way to disprove their claims because they're totally untestable. In any case, on the naturalistic view, it's clear why we need brains and how they developed. On the theistic view, it's anybody's guess. This chapter is mostly about brains, but here Calvo devotes a page and a half to talking about DNA. He says,
DNA is so complex and carries such an incredibly composite series of letters that we have no other choice but to conclude the intelligence behind the message. To assume that the results of DNA were nothing more than a random series of cells colliding into one another, forming together this complex message gradually throughout time, would be intellectually dishonest and complete folly.
This is the same argument as all the others. You take a natural phenomenon, whether it's animals, plants, planets, brains, or DNA, you point out how amazing it is, and these things are amazing, and your conclusion is God. I don't know how else to tell you. There's something missing from this argument. The universe is vast and complex and awesome. That does not entail that it was created by a spirit. Calling me a liar and a fool doesn't make your argument better. Rather, by resorting to schoolyard taunts, you expose the weakness of your position. Next, Mr. Calvo talks about human personality.
Why is it that every human being is different and unique in their own individual way? How can an unintelligent, random process of genetic mutation cause humans to develop in such a way that differentiates with one another for the purpose of uniqueness and individuality? If Darwinian evolution is true, and the cause of the universe was not only unintelligent but random, then we would have a recurrence of repetitive processes, resulting in the same type of person.
This is pure, unadulterated nonsense. First of all, as I've pointed out already, it's misleading the way you keep using the word random to describe natural processes. Genetic mutations may be random. Natural selection is not. But even if we assume that everything is random, how would that result in repetitive processes, generating the same type of person? That's like the exact opposite of what random means. Evolution depends on variation. Every member of a species is a little bit different from the others, and the ones that manage to reproduce are the ones that get to pass along their traits. Anyway, this whole thread is a red herring, as it's assuming that people's unique personality traits come from their DNA, as if personality were a wholly biological trait. Calvo says,
It's interesting how something of a big bang or evolution could have developed beings with their own personal characteristics, with specific traits and skills.
This is so strange. Isn't it obvious that people's personalities develop over the course of their lives based on their experiences and what happens to them? There can be a biological component too, but surely who you become depends a lot on the road you've traveled. That's why when you get to know someone, you notice he has his father's temper, his mother's sense of humor, a fear of dogs dating back to something that happened when he was 3 years old, a love of the ocean because of the way he spent the summers as a child. Of course, you can't explain everything about a person. It's all too subtle and complicated for that, but surely you've noticed that a person's background, their upbringing, has something to do with who they are. This is why you get people arguing about how much of a person's characteristics are determined by biology and how much are determined by the person's environment. The so-called nature versus nurture debate. I have my opinions. I don't have the answers. But I'm amazed that Mr. Calvo has been asleep for that whole conversation. He thinks a person's traits either come from God or the Big Bang. At last, Calvo makes his final argument in the chapter, returning to the subject of morality.
How do we determine what absolute good and evil are? One would have to assume something is wrong, but by doing so, they are appealing to a standard beyond our human minds that validates these claims.
I talked a little bit about morality in my last video. I said our moral feelings develop from our instinct as social animals to protect our tribe. And then somewhere in our history, civilization realizes it's a higher order morality to regard the whole world as our tribe. So it becomes our duty to protect not only our race or our nation, but all people or all creatures. So I'm not convinced that we need some metaphysical, transcendent basis for morality. It seems self-evident to me that if I want to live my life and be free and not worry about being murdered when I walk down the street, and you want that too, if everybody wants that, the best kind of world is one where everybody's free and nobody's getting murdered. We think about our own needs and wants, and then, because we have empathy for other people, we consider their needs and wants equally. And from this empathetic, equal consideration of everyone's needs, you get what we call justice and morality. Not only is this good enough, in most situations, we would say a behavior is more moral when it's based on compassion and empathy rather than bowing to authority or seeking rewards and avoiding punishments. If a kid decides not to poke his little sister in the eye, we would say it's more morally developed for him to make that choice because he cares about his sister and doesn't want her to be hurt, and not because mom said so, or because if he does it, she won't give him any cookies. In the same way, I think a whole system of morality based on empathy and caring is more grounded and more meaningful than a system based on God's authority, or the promise of heaven and the threat of hell. Plus, if there's no secular basis for morality, how are you going to share a world with atheists and agnostics and Buddhists and Hindus and anybody else who doesn't share your views on God? If the only way we can make moral claims is by referring to God's authority, then those claims will sound like nonsense to anyone who doesn't believe. A system of morality based on human wants and needs is more universally authoritative, since virtually everyone can agree that human wants and needs exist. In this last section, Mr. Calvo gives a brief list of moral laws, and I think it's worth taking a moment to look at that list. He lists murder, rape, pedophilia, adultery, lying, stealing, and abortion as examples of things that are absolutely, unequivocally evil. Just a couple of things. First of all, Calvo knows he's being provocative by putting abortion on this list. Obviously, this is a controversial issue with strong feelings on both sides, and Mr. Calvo is taking a shot at anyone who disagrees with him. He goes on to say,
No one in their right mind, literally, would disagree with these facts.
So anyone who has a different opinion on this issue is, according to him, literally crazy. I'm not going to argue abortion with Almando Calvo, but I will say, I think issues like this, where people of good conscience sincerely disagree, undermine this notion that there's a universal divine moral law written in our hearts. Of course, Mr. Calvo has to say that anyone who disagrees with him is evil or crazy, because the alternative is that there's more than one valid perspective on this issue. And to him, that's just unacceptable. The only other thing I want to mention is that Calvo includes rape on this list. I agree that rape belongs on any short list of the most heinous crimes, but the Bible does not agree with you on this. It's not in the 10 Commandments. How did it not make the top 10? And while there are some verses in the Bible limiting or prohibiting rape, it's not condemned as vehemently or unambiguously as one might expect. For instance, Deuteronomy 22 says that anyone who violates a woman who's engaged should be stoned to death, That's a pretty strong prohibition. Except it also says that if the woman didn't cry for help, that makes it consensual, and she needs to get stoned to death too. So according to the Bible, rape survivors who didn't scream loud enough are guilty of the same crime as a rapist and deserve the same punishment. And it gets worse. That rule only applies to women who are married or betrothed. The same chapter in Deuteronomy says when a man rapes a virgin who isn't betrothed, he has to pay her father 50 shekels of silver and marry her. This is not my idea of condemning a heinous moral evil. Yes, the verse provides a sort of protection against random acts of sexual assault, but I would say it regulates sexual assault rather than criminalizing it. If a man sees a virgin he'd like to marry, and he has the 50 shekels to pay her dad, to him, this might look like a pretty good deal. Now, defenders of the Bible are quick to point out that this was a different time, a different culture, that these laws look barbaric to us, but at the time they were actually improvements. Let's grant that that may be true. But who's the moral relativist now? I thought the whole point was that God's word provides a divine, eternal, unchanging standard for absolute right and wrong. So why doesn't the Bible care about women's bodily autonomy? Why does it treat them like the property of their fathers or husbands? And it does no good to say that this is just the Old Testament and these laws are no longer in effect. That doesn't matter. If you're telling me that God endorsed these laws for any group of people at any time in any place, that's enough to discredit the whole idea of an absolute eternal standard. I haven't even mentioned slavery. Mr. Calvo doesn't include slavery on his list of moral evils, but I assume he's against it. Just like sexual assault, slavery is regulated in the Bible, but not unequivocally condemned. Again, apologists try to defend this by saying these rules were appropriate to a certain place and time. This is not what we'd expect to see if an all-knowing, benevolent spirit handed down his eternal moral wisdom. This is what we'd expect to see if an ancient tribe wrote down their ideas about morality, and it made sense to them at the time, and some of it still makes sense today, and some of it just doesn't. All of this points to the conclusion that our moral understanding is still developing, still evolving. That's it for chapters 2 and 3 in A Conscious Universe. If you have thoughts on any of these topics, please let me know in the comments. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching my video. This is apparently something I do now, so if you're interested, I guess you can hit that subscribe button. Till next time.